where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to the Countess's Chronicles channel.
What if I told you that the worst thing that ever happened to you might actually be the door to your greatest transformation? Sounds crazy, right? But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to admit. Sometimes being rejected by the wrong people is exactly what positions you to be accepted by the right ones. And I'm not talking about some fairy tale nonsense where everything magically works out. I'm talking about the messy, complicated, painfully real journey of two people who were deemed defective by everyone around them, only to discover that maybe, just maybe, the world's definition of valuable was completely wrong. This is Eleanor's story, and it starts in the darkest place imaginable. The moment her own parents looked at her infertility and saw not a daughter, but a business opportunity. The segredo most people don't realize is that your deepest wound can become your greatest teacher, but only if you survive long enough to learn the lesson. Here's what's going to challenge everything you believe about worth, love, and what makes a person valuable. Eleanor was sold, not kidnapped by strangers, not taken by force, sold by the two people who were supposed to protect her. Her crime? Being unable to bear children in a world that measured a woman's entire existence by her womb's productivity. And before you think this is just another tragic tale of a victim, let me stop you right there. Because what happened next breaks every rule you've been taught about how these stories are supposed to go. Duke Sebastian didn't ride in on a white horse to save her. He didn't fall in love at first sight. He didn't even particularly want a wife. What he wanted was someone as broken as he was. Someone who wouldn't expect him to be what he could never be. Someone who understood what it felt like to be measured and found wanting by a world with impossibly narrow standards. This is the mysterio at the heart of their story. Two people society rejected found each other not despite their flaws, but because of them. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is going to be one of those predictable romances where the damaged souls heal each other through the power of love and everything ends up perfect. Wrong. What Eleanor and Sebastian discovered is far more radical, far more uncomfortable, and far more useful than any fairy tale ending. They discovered that you don't need to be fixed to be worthy of connection. That being different isn't the same as being less than. That sometimes the people who reject you are doing you the biggest favor of your life by removing themselves from it. But getting to that revelation required both of them to walk through fire first, to confront the occulto beliefs they'd internalized about their own inadequacy, to risk vulnerability with someone who could hurt them just as badly as everyone else had. And it started with a transaction that looked like the end of Eleanor's story, but turned out to be just the beginning. Here's the paradox that's going to shift your entire perspective. Eleanor's parents thought they were getting rid of a problem when they sold her to Sebastian. They thought they were finally making their defective daughter useful. What they actually did was remove Eleanor from a toxic environment that would have slowly killed her spirit and place her in proximity to the one person who could see her true value. Not because Sebastian was some enlightened saint. He was just as damaged, just as convinced of his own unworthiness as she was. But sometimes, two broken people can see in each other what they can't see in themselves. Sometimes the person who's been rejected for similar reasons is the only one qualified to say, actually, there's nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with the system that rejected us both. This isn't a story about being saved. It's a story about two people who saved each other by refusing to accept the cruel narratives their families and society had written about them. But here's where it gets controversial. And I need you to stay with me because this matters. Eleanor's transformation didn't start when Sebastian treated her kindly. It started when she stopped waiting for her worth to be validated by the people who'd already proven they couldn't see it. The conflict you're about to witness isn't between Eleanor and Sebastian. It's between the people they were told they should be and the people they actually are. And spoiler alert, the authentic versions win, but not without a fight. It started when she looked at this strange arrangement. This marriage that was supposed to be nothing more than a business transaction, and decided that maybe, just maybe, she could build something real from it. Not because she needed Sebastian to complete her, but because she finally found someone who wasn't trying to force her into a mold she was never meant to fit. So why should you care about a fictional duchess from centuries ago? Because Eleanor's wound is your wound. Maybe you weren't sold for infertility, but you've been rejected for something you can't control or change. Maybe your family didn't literally trade you for money, but they've made you feel like your value depends on meeting their expectations. Maybe you haven't been called defective out loud, but you've internalized that message from 1,000 small interactions that told you you're not quite right, not quite enough, not quite what people want. The disappearance of self-worth doesn't happen all at once. It's death by 1,000 cuts, each small rejection confirming what you're terrified might be true about yourself. Eleanor's story matters because it shows what's possible when you stop trying to prove your worth to people who've already decided you don't have any, and start building connections with people who see you clearly and choose you anyway. Here's your quick reward, the thing you can take away right now, even before you hear the full story. The people who reject you are revealing their limitations, not yours. When Eleanor's mother said, "At least you'll be useful somehow," she wasn't diagnosing Eleanor's deficiency. She was exposing her own inability to see value beyond narrow, conventional measures. When society called Sebastian peculiar for being sensitive and preferring books to blood sports, they weren't identifying his problem. They were revealing theirs. Every rejection you've faced, every time someone made you feel less than, every moment you've been measured against impossible standards and found wanting, those moments told you more about the people judging you than they ever told you about yourself. And the sooner you understand that, the sooner you can stop carrying shame that was never yours to bear. What you're about to read isn't comfortable. It's going to make you think about your own wounds, your own rejected parts, your own conspiracies of silence around the things that make you feel inadequate. Eleanor and Sebastian's journey from transaction to transformation is going to hold up a mirror to every relationship in your life, where you've performed instead of being real, where you've hidden instead of being seen, where you've accepted crumbs of conditional approval instead of demanding the full meal of unconditional acceptance. But if you're brave enough to stay with their story, if you're willing to sit with the discomfort of recognizing yourself in their struggles, you might just discover what they discovered. That your so-called flaws might actually be the most interesting, most authentic, most valuable parts of you. And that the right people, your people, will see those parts and move closer, not away. Ready to see how two defective aristocrats accidentally built something more real than all the perfect marriages around them? Let's begin with the day Eleanor's parents called her into the study and changed her life forever, though not in the way any of them expected. You know what's funny about desperation? It doesn't announce itself with drums and trumpets. It creeps in quietly, disguised as opportunity, wrapped in pretty words like arrangement and strategic alliance. But let's be real here. When Duke Sebastian showed up at Eleanor's doorstep offering gold in exchange for a wife, he wasn't looking for love. He was shopping. And in this twisted tale, Eleanor wasn't the customer. She was the merchandise on display, tagged with a price that would save her family's crumbling estate. The proposal came with all the formality of a business contract, because that's exactly what it was. Sebastian wanted a spouse who wouldn't burden him with expectations of romance, children, or those pesky illusions people call happily ever after. Eleanor would sign her name on that parchment like someone signing their own sentence, ink still wet with the weight of sacrifice. Think about it like this. Imagine walking into a negotiation where you're not sitting at the table. You are the table. That's the enigma Eleanor faced. Her father laid out the terms with the enthusiasm of a merchant selling livestock at market. Duke Sebastian's offering enough to restore our lands, pay our debts, and secure your sister's futures, he'd said, avoiding Eleanor's eyes. What he didn't say, but what hung in the air like smoke, was the unspoken truth. And all it costs is you. There's something deeply unsettling about being reduced to a transaction, isn't there? It's like when someone values your car more than your conversation. Eleanor wasn't a daughter in that moment. She was a solution to a problem, a key to unlock a vault of gold coins. The vestiges of her childhood dreams disappeared that afternoon, replaced by the cold reality of aristocratic survival. Here's where it gets darker, and I need you to really hear this. Eleanor's mother, the woman who'd raised her, who'd supposedly loved her, delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "At least you'll be useful somehow," she'd said, adjusting Eleanor's dress for the meeting with Sebastian. Those 7 words carried more poison than a viper's bite. They confirmed every secret fear Eleanor had harbored about herself, every whispered doubt about her worth. It wasn't just about her inability to bear children anymore. It was about her entire existence being measured, weighed, and found wanting. Can you imagine? The one person who should have defended her instead became the prosecutor, judge, and executioner of her self-worth. That moment created a wound that would take years to heal, a silence between mother and daughter that spoke louder than any argument ever could. Now, let's talk about something you've probably felt but never named. You know that moment when someone you love reduces you to a single characteristic? Maybe it's your weight, your job status, your relationship status, or some perceived flaw they can't stop mentioning. Suddenly, you're not a whole person anymore. You're just that one thing they've decided defines you. That's exactly what happened to Eleanor. Years of being the infertile daughter, the disappointment, the problem child who couldn't fulfill her biological destiny. It's like being cast in a play where everyone else wrote your character description, and you're just forced to perform it. The conspiracy of silence around her worth had become so normalized that even Eleanor started believing it. When your own family treats you as defective merchandise, it's hard not to internalize that verdict and wear it like a scarlet letter. The negotiations between Sebastian and Eleanor's family happened quickly. Too quickly for second thoughts or escape plans. Within 3 weeks, the arrangements were finalized. Sebastian would pay immediately. The wedding would follow within the month. Eleanor would move to his remote estate in the countryside, far from the prying eyes of society, and far from the family who'd sold her like a prized horse with hidden defects. During those final days at home, Eleanor walked through the manor like a ghost, touching walls she'd never touch again, memorizing hallways she'd never walk again. Her sisters avoided her, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from relief that they weren't the ones chosen for sacrifice. The hidden agreement had terms written in the official contract, but the real terms, the emotional ones, were written in the looks her family gave Eleanor, a mixture of gratitude and shame that told her everything she needed to know about where she stood. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who see you as a means to an end. It's different from being alone. It's being fundamentally misunderstood, fundamentally devalued by the very people who should champion you. Eleanor felt it in every interaction those final weeks. Her father's relieved sighs when he reviewed the financial documents, her mother's tight-lipped satisfaction at solving the problem, Even the servants whispered about Eleanor's sacrifice, as if she were some noble martyr instead of a woman with no real choice. The mysterio of it all was how they convinced themselves this was acceptable, how they slept at night after essentially trafficking their own daughter. But aristocratic families are good at that, aren't they? Dressing up cruelty in the language of duty and honor, making the prohibido seem proper by calling it tradition. The night before the wedding, Eleanor stood at her window looking at the moon, wondering if Sebastian ever looked at the same moon from his distant castle. Did he feel anything about this arrangement? Was he as empty inside as the contract suggested? Or was there some hidden códigos in his behavior that she'd missed? Some hint that he was more than just a wealthy recluse buying companionship? Eleanor had heard rumors, of course, whispers about why such a powerful man remained unmarried at 28, why he rarely attended social functions, why his estate was notorious for its isolation. Some said Sebastian was scarred, others said he was mad. Still others suggested darker secrets. But honestly, those rumors didn't scare Eleanor. What scared her was the possibility that Sebastian was exactly what the contract suggested. A man so disconnected from emotion that he could marry a stranger and never think twice about it. That would make two of them, wouldn't it? Two broken souls entering a covenant without hope. On the morning of her departure, Eleanor's father handed her the signed contract with the finality of closing a ledger book. "You've done well for this family," he said, and those were his goodbye words. Not, "I'll miss you," not, "Write to us." Just acknowledgement of a transaction completed successfully. As Eleanor's carriage rolled away from the only home she'd ever known, she didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere between the proposal and the wedding. What she felt instead was a strange numbness, like watching someone else's life from behind thick glass. The revelation hit her as the family estate disappeared behind the hills. She'd spent her whole life seeking approval from people who were never going to give it. And now, she was traveling toward a man who'd married her specifically because he expected nothing from her. There was a twisted freedom in that, wasn't there? When you've already hit rock bottom, you can't fall any further. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but that journey toward Sebastian's castle was also a journey toward something she'd never expected. Something that would challenge everything she believed about worth, love, and what it means to be truly seen. Here's the thing about fairy tales. They lie. They show you the prince on the white horse, the charming smile, the castle full of light and laughter. But they never show you the prince who lives in the shadows, the one who built walls so high that even sunlight struggles to get through. Sebastian wasn't what anyone expected, least of all Eleanor. At 28, he should have been in his prime, attending balls, hosting grand parties, playing the political games that aristocrats love so much. Instead, Sebastian lived like a hermit in his massive estate, surrounded by servants who whispered his name with a mixture of respect and unease. Rich beyond measure, powerful enough to influence kingdoms, yet completely and utterly alone. There was a segredo wrapped around Sebastian like a cloak, something that kept everyone at arm's length, something that made mothers pull their daughters away when his name came up in conversation. The mysterio wasn't just about him, it was him entirely. Let me paint you a picture, because this matters. Imagine being an island made entirely of gold. Sounds amazing, right? Everyone can see you sparkling from miles away. Everyone knows you're valuable. Everyone talks about you. But here's the catch. Nobody actually comes ashore. They admire you from their boats. They circle your waters. They even write songs about your beauty. But landing? Getting close enough to actually know you? That's where they draw the line. That was Sebastian's existence in a nutshell. People wanted his money, his title, his influence. They just didn't want him. There's a specific kind of torture in being desired for everything except who you actually are. It creates this bizarre paradox where you're constantly surrounded by people, yet drowning in loneliness. The vestigio of human connection in Sebastian's life had faded years ago, replaced by transactional relationships that felt more like business meetings than friendships. Now, why would a man like Sebastian agree to marry someone society labeled defective? Here's where the story gets interesting, where the codigos start revealing themselves. See, everyone assumed Sebastian wanted a docile wife who'd stay quiet and look pretty at formal events. But that wasn't it at all. What he really wanted, what he desperately needed, was someone who wouldn't expect from him what he couldn't give. Eleanor's infertility wasn't a flaw to Sebastian. It was a qualification, a feature, not a bug. Think about it from his perspective. If Sebastian married a normal woman, she'd expect children, heirs, a dynasty. She'd eventually realize something was deeply wrong when those expectations weren't met. She'd ask questions, she'd pry, she'd discover his occulto truth. But marrying Eleanor? That was genius in its own twisted way. Eleanor came with her own reasons for not having children, her own baggage, her own walls. It was a conspiracy of mutual protection, two damaged souls agreeing not to damage each other further. Their first meeting was nothing like the romantic novels describe. There were no butterflies, no love at first sight, no orchestra swelling in the background. It happened in Sebastian's castle's receiving room on a gray afternoon that matched both their moods. When Eleanor's eyes met Sebastian's for the first time, she didn't see a monster or a saint. She saw something far more unsettling. She saw herself, that same look of resigned acceptance, that same exhaustion from carrying secrets too heavy for one person, that same bone-deep loneliness that comes from being perpetually misunderstood. Sebastian saw it too. You could tell by the way his expression shifted, just for a second, before the formal mask slid back into place. It was like two veterans of different wars recognizing each other's battle scars. Neither Eleanor nor Sebastian spoke about it during that first encounter. How could they? You don't just blurt out, "Hey, you look as broken as I feel," during a formal introduction. But the recognition was there, hovering in the silencio between polite greetings and careful pleasantries. Have you ever met someone and felt this strange sense of kinship you couldn't explain? Not attraction necessarily, not even friendship, but something deeper. Recognition. Like your soul knows their soul has walked through similar fires. That's what happened between Eleanor and Sebastian in that receiving room. Most people miss these moments because they're not dramatic. There's no lightning bolt, no cosmic revelation, just a quiet understanding that passes between two people who've been hurt in similar ways. Eleanor stood there in her traveling dress, dust from the road still clinging to her hem, and Sebastian stood in his formal attire, every button perfectly placed, and between them was this invisible thread of shared pain. The enigma of human connection is that sometimes it starts not with what we have in common, but with what we've both lost. They'd both lost the privilege of being seen as whole. Society had chipped away at both of them until they felt like damaged goods, unworthy of real love or genuine connection. The wedding ceremony was brief, attended only by necessary witnesses and a priest who seemed eager to finish and leave. There were no celebrations, no toasts, no well-wishers throwing rice and flowers, just signatures on documents and the exchange of rings that felt more like shackles than symbols of union. Afterwards, Sebastian showed Eleanor to her quarters. The West Wing, he explained, fully furnished and staffed to meet her needs. His rooms were in the East Wing. The message was crystal clear. We may be married, but we're not together. Eleanor unpacked her belongings in silence, while Sebastian retreated to his study. And that's how their life together began. Two strangers sharing an address, but nothing else. The conflict wasn't between them. It was within each of them, this internal war between wanting connection and fearing it, between hoping for something more and accepting that this was probably all they deserved. But here's what neither Eleanor nor Sebastian understood yet, what neither could see through their pain and protective walls. Sometimes the universe puts two broken people together not to fix each other. That's not anyone's job. But to show each other that broken doesn't mean worthless. That the desaparecimiento of one dream doesn't mean the death of all dreams. That being rejected by some people doesn't mean being rejectable to all people. They were about to embark on the strangest journey either had ever taken, one that would challenge every assumption they'd made about themselves, about love, about what's possible when two people decide to stop performing and start being real. But that night, as Eleanor lay in her unfamiliar bed, listening to the castle settle around her, all she knew was that she'd traded one prison for another. At least this one had better furniture and a husband who didn't pretend to care. Little did Eleanor know, Sebastian was lying in his own bed, thinking the exact same thing, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, wondering if bringing another person into his shadowed existence would make the loneliness better or infinitely worse. The revelation would come, but not yet. First, they'd have to survive each other. Living with someone and living around someone are two completely different things, and those first weeks proved it beyond any doubt. Eleanor and Sebastian existed in the same space, like ghosts haunting different rooms, passing each other in hallways with polite nods and empty smiles that never reached their eyes. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 7. Always served, rarely shared. Eleanor would eat in the morning room while Sebastian took his meals in the study. When they did sit at the same table for appearances, the silencio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Fork against plate. Wine poured into crystal. How was your day? Fine, thank you. The most meaningless conversations two married people could possibly have. Eleanor had her quarters in the West Wing, Sebastian had his in the East, and there might as well have been an ocean between them instead of just marble floors and mahogany doors. The segredo both carried remained locked away, buried under layers of formality and carefully maintained distance. Here's what that kind of arrangement does to a person, and I want you to really understand this. It's like living in the fanciest hotel you can imagine. Gold fixtures, silk sheets, gourmet food delivered on silver platters. Everything's beautiful. Everything's comfortable. Everything's absolutely perfect. Except it's not yours. You're not home. You're just staying there. There's no warmth, no personality, no soul in the spaces you occupy. You can't relax because you're always aware you're performing, always aware that this isn't real life, just an expensive imitation of it. That was Eleanor and Sebastian's existence in the castle. All the luxury money could buy, surrounded by priceless art and ancient tapestries, sleeping in beds that kings would envy. But none of it mattered, because they were living in an emotional desert, a place where everything looked alive, but nothing actually grew. The occulto pain of that kind of existence is that from the outside, everyone thinks you have it all. Inside, you're dying of thirst, surrounded by fountains that only flow with emptiness. Eleanor's days developed a rhythm, a monotonous pattern that helped her survive without actually living. She'd wake at dawn, dress herself because she insisted on that small dignity, then wander down to the library. And what a library it was! 3 floors of books, rolling ladders, reading nooks with windows overlooking gardens that seemed to bloom year-round. Eleanor would lose herself in stories of women who had it better, who found love, who mattered to someone. Historical romances were her favorite torture, reading about duchesses who were cherished, about arranged marriages that somehow became real. It was like pressing on a bruise, painful, but somehow necessary. Meanwhile, Sebastian spent his nights, and I mean actual nights, from sunset to sunrise, locked in his study. The servants whispered that he barely slept, that candlelight flickered under his door until morning. What was Sebastian doing in there? Working on estate business? Avoiding Eleanor? Wrestling with his own Mysterio demons? Eleanor didn't know, and the unspoken rules of their arrangement meant she couldn't ask. They were prisoners in a golden cage, both serving sentences for crimes they didn't commit. But every story has a turning point, doesn't it? Every prison eventually shows a crack in its walls. Theirs came during a spring storm that hit the countryside with unusual violence. Thunder that shook the castle's foundation, lightning that turned night into day, rain that sounded like judgment itself, pounding against ancient stones. Eleanor had gone to bed early that night, exhausted from another day of existing without living. But sleep brought no peace. Instead, it brought nightmares. Eleanor was back home, back in that final conversation with her mother. "At least you'll be useful somehow." The words echoed, multiplied, became a chorus of condemnation. In the dream, everyone Eleanor had ever known was chanting it, pointing at her, reducing her to that single devastating assessment. Eleanor woke up screaming, actually screaming, something she hadn't done since childhood. The sound ripped through the castle's quiet, a raw expression of pain that couldn't be contained anymore. And for the first time since the wedding, something changed. Eleanor heard footsteps running, actually running, through the corridors. Sebastian was coming. The Duke, who kept his distance, who maintained their careful separation, was racing toward Eleanor through the storm-shaken darkness. The door burst open, and there Sebastian stood, breathing hard, hair disheveled, wearing just a shirt and trousers, the most informal Eleanor had ever seen him. No jacket, no perfectly tied cravat, no aristocratic mask firmly in place. Just a man who'd heard someone in distress and responded with pure human instinct. "What happened? Are you hurt?" The concern in Sebastian's voice wasn't practiced or polite. It was real, raw, genuine in a way that caught Eleanor completely off guard. She was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, trembling not from cold, but from the emotional vestigio of that nightmare. For a long moment, Eleanor and Sebastian just stared at each other, and something shifted in the air between them. This wasn't the formal dance they'd been performing. This was real life crashing through their carefully constructed walls. The conflitto between maintaining distance and acknowledging shared humanity reached a breaking point, and humanity won. Sebastian took a hesitant step into the room, then another, crossing the threshold they'd both agreed never to cross. "I'm sorry," Eleanor managed to say, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "I didn't mean to disturb you. It was just a dream, a stupid dream." But her voice cracked on those words because it wasn't stupid, and they both knew it. "Dreams aren't stupid when they make you scream like that," Sebastian said quietly, surprising Eleanor with the gentleness of his tone. He grabbed a chair from near the window and pulled it closer to the bed. Not too close, still respectful, but closer than they'd ever been. "Do you want to talk about it?" And there it was, the first genuine question Sebastian had asked Eleanor since the wedding. Not, "How are you?" as a formality, but a real inquiry into her actual state of being. The enigma of that moment was how something so terrible, a nightmare, a scream in the dark, could become the bridge they desperately needed. Sometimes connection happens in crisis, when we're too broken to maintain our defenses, too raw to keep pretending everything's fine. Eleanor looked at Sebastian sitting there, at the concern in his eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. She decided to stop performing. She decided to be honest. "I dreamed about my mother," Eleanor began, and once she started talking, the words tumbled out like water through a broken dam. She told Sebastian about that final conversation, about being reduced to a single function, about feeling like merchandise instead of a person. Eleanor confessed her deepest fear, that maybe her mother was right. Maybe she really wasn't enough. Maybe her only value was in being useful to others. The desaparecimiento of her self-worth, the slow erosion of believing she mattered, all came pouring out in that storm-dark room. And Sebastian listened, actually listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes, didn't try to fix Eleanor or minimize her pain. He just sat there and bore witness to her breaking, to her honesty, to her truth. When Eleanor finally finished, exhausted from the emotional purging, Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would echo in Eleanor's mind for years to come. "I understand that feeling, more than you know." And in those words, carefully chosen, weighted with his own pain, Eleanor heard the promise of something neither had expected when they signed that contract. She heard the possibility of being truly seen by another human being, of finding companionship in the last place either of them thought to look, with each other. The desaparecimiento of their emotional barriers wasn't complete yet, not by far, but it had begun, and that beginning would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. That night changed everything for Eleanor and Sebastian, though not in the dramatic way novels describe. There was no sudden declaration of love, no passionate embrace, no orchestra playing in the background. What happened was quieter, more profound, and infinitely more real. After Eleanor had finished pouring out her pain, after the tears had dried and the storm outside began to calm, Sebastian did something unexpected. He stayed. Not in Eleanor's room, propriety still had its place, but he stayed in that chair, and for the first time since their wedding, they actually talked. Not about the weather or estate business, or any of the safe, meaningless topics they'd hidden behind for weeks. They talked about the weight of expectations, about living in a world that measures your worth by standards you can never meet. "I know what it's like," Sebastian said finally, his voice carrying the vestigio of old wounds, "to feel like you're failing at being human, simply because you can't give people what they want from you." The segredo in those words hung between them like a confession waiting to be fully spoken. Here's where vulnerability becomes the only bridge that actually works between two isolated souls. And I need you to understand this because it's crucial. See, most people think strength is about walls, about armor, about never showing weakness or admitting pain. But real strength, that's being brave enough to let someone see the parts of yourself you've been hiding, the parts you're ashamed of, the parts you think make you unlovable. When Eleanor told Sebastian she didn't know how to be enough for anyone, she was handing him ammunition he could have used against her. When Sebastian responded by admitting he felt the same way, he was doing something even more dangerous. He was trusting Eleanor with his own brokenness. That exchange wasn't just conversation. It was an agreement, a pact. It said, "I'll show you my scars if you show me yours. I'll be honest about my mysterio if you're honest about yours." And suddenly, their arrangement wasn't just about convenience anymore. It was about survival, about finding one ally in a world that had rejected them both. Eleanor learned something about Sebastian that night that the rumors never captured, that the whispered conversations in drawing rooms never understood. Sebastian wasn't strange because he was cruel or mad, or any of the dramatic things people imagined. He was strange because he was different, because he didn't fit the mold society had created for men of his station, because he felt too much in a world that demanded emotional stoniness from its aristocrats. "They call me peculiar," Sebastian admitted, a bitter smile crossing his face. "I don't hunt because I can't stomach killing animals for sport. I don't attend balls because the noise and crowds overwhelm me. I prefer books to people, silence to small talk, honesty to the games everyone plays." The revelation wasn't shocking to Eleanor. It was relieving. Sebastian wasn't a monster hiding in shadows. He was a sensitive soul who'd learned that the world punishes sensitivity, so he'd withdrawn to protect himself. Just like Eleanor had withdrawn after being told her worth was measured solely by her womb's productivity. Two different wounds, same survival strategy. Build walls and hope no one gets close enough to hurt you again. Let me tell you about the moment when masks fall off, because most people miss it when it happens. It's not dramatic. There's no shattering glass or breaking chains. It's quiet, almost anticlimactic. It happened when Sebastian said, "For years, I have been pretending that isolation is the same as independence, that not needing people is the same as being strong. But honestly, I'm just scared. Scared of being rejected for who I actually am. Scared of trying to be what I'm not. Scared of failing at something everyone else seems to do naturally." Sebastian's voice cracked on that last word, and Eleanor saw him for the first time without the aristocratic polish, without the careful distance, without any of the protective layers he wore like armor. Just a 28-year-old man who'd been lonely for so long he'd forgotten what connection felt like. The occulto truth they'd both been carrying, that they were terrified of being known, was finally out in the open, and exposing it didn't make them weaker. It made them real to each other. Eleanor responded with her own confession, words she'd never said aloud to anyone. "After my mother said what she said, I stopped believing I could be loved for who I am. I started thinking that utility was the best I could hope for. Being useful, serving a purpose, fulfilling a function. I've been so focused on what I can't do, what I can't give, that I forgot to ask if maybe those aren't the only things that matter." There was power in that admission, a kind of strength that comes from naming your pain instead of running from it. Sebastian leaned forward in his chair, and in the dim candlelight of Eleanor's room, she could see understanding in his eyes. Not pity. Eleanor would have hated pity, but recognition. Sebastian knew that particular brand of self-doubt intimately, had wrestled with it in his own way. "What if," Sebastian said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "what if we've both been measuring ourselves with the wrong ruler? What if the things they said we're lacking aren't actually what makes us human?" The enigma of that question hung in the air, challenging everything both Eleanor and Sebastian had accepted as truth. From that night forward, something fundamental shifted in the castle's atmosphere. The silencio that had felt oppressive became comfortable. Eleanor and Sebastian started having breakfast together, not out of obligation, but because morning coffee tasted better with company. Sebastian would ask what Eleanor was reading, and she'd actually tell him, sharing her thoughts on the characters and plots instead of giving one-word answers. Eleanor would inquire about Sebastian's work, and he'd explain the estate management challenges he faced, treating her like an intellectual equal rather than a decoration to be maintained. These weren't grand gestures or dramatic declarations. They were small acts of inclusion, Tiny rebellions against the isolation both had accepted as inevitable. The códigos of their interaction began changing, evolving from formal protocol to genuine interest. When Eleanor laughed at something Sebastian said, a real laugh, not the polite titter expected from aristocratic wives, he looked almost shocked, as if he'd forgotten that joy could exist in his presence. That laugh became the first crack in Sebastian's armor, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than his fears and failures. Here's what I want you to take away from this, because it applies to your life too. Connection doesn't happen because two perfect people find each other. It happens when two imperfect people decide to stop pretending they're perfect. When you spend your whole life hiding your struggles, your fears, your perceived inadequacies, you end up surrounded by people who only know your mask. They might like your mask just fine, but they don't know you. The real you. The messy, complicated, beautifully flawed you. What happened between Eleanor and Sebastian that stormy night was rare and precious. Two people deciding that being known, truly known, was worth the risk of potential rejection. They'd both been rejected before, by families, by society, by their own harsh self-judgments. But something about sharing that rejection, about sitting in the dark and admitting, "I'm scared too," made it bearable. The conflito that had defined their early marriage, the war between wanting connection and fearing vulnerability, began to resolve not through victory, but through surrender. Eleanor and Sebastian surrendered the pretense, and in doing so, found something neither had dared hope for: a companion who understood not despite their wounds, but because of them. Love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks and symphonies. Sometimes it whispers through the mundane, sneaks up on you in the ordinary moments you'd normally overlook. That's how it started for Eleanor and Sebastian, not with grand romantic gestures, but with small, almost invisible shifts in their daily routine. Sebastian began asking Eleanor how her day went, and actually waiting for the answer, not the perfunctory, "fine, thank you," she'd trained herself to give, but real answers about the books she'd read, the gardens she'd walked through, the thoughts that occupied her mind. Eleanor started leaving fresh flowers on Sebastian's desk, first tentatively, worried he'd find it intrusive, but then regularly when she noticed they made him smile. Wildflowers from the estate grounds, nothing fancy, but arranged with care in simple vases. These weren't dramatic declarations. They were quiet acknowledgments that said, "I see you, I'm thinking of you, you matter to me." The segredo to building connection isn't in the big moments everyone remembers. It's in the small moments everyone else misses. Let me give you an analogy that'll make this crystal clear, because understanding this changes everything about how you approach relationships. Think about planting a garden. On day one, you put seeds in the soil. Nothing happens. You water them. Still nothing visible. Day 2, day 3, day 4, just dark earth that looks exactly the same. If you judged your garden on those first days, you'd think you failed, that nothing's growing, that you wasted your time and effort. But beneath the surface, roots are forming, foundations are being built. Life is organizing itself for the breakthrough. Then one morning, you see a tiny green shoot pushing through the dirt. It's small, barely there, but it's real. That's what was happening between Eleanor and Sebastian. Every shared breakfast, every genuine conversation, every small gesture of consideration was a seed being watered. The mysterio of relationships is that growth happens invisibly until suddenly it doesn't. You can't force it, can't rush it, but if you're patient and consistent with those small acts of care, something beautiful eventually breaks through. The dinner invitation was Sebastian's idea, and it came about 3 weeks after that storm night conversation. Sebastian appeared at the library one afternoon while Eleanor was reading, looking oddly nervous for a duke in his own castle. "Would you? That is, I was wondering if you might join me for dinner tonight. Not because it's expected or required, but because I'd enjoy your company." The hesitation in Sebastian's voice, the vulnerability in that request, told Eleanor everything about how much it cost him to ask. This wasn't the transaction they'd agreed to. This was Sebastian wanting Eleanor's presence for its own sake. Eleanor agreed, of course, and that evening marked a turning point neither had anticipated. They talked for 3 hours, long after the servants had cleared the plates and extinguished most of the candles. Eleanor and Sebastian discussed philosophy from the books she'd been reading, politics from the correspondence he managed, dreams they'd abandoned and others they still secretly harbored. The conversational códigos they'd developed, safe topics, careful boundaries, dissolved as they discovered the joy of actually knowing someone beyond surface pleasantries. The occulto loneliness both had carried began to lift, replaced by something foreign yet wonderful: companionship. Then came the moment that still makes me smile when I think about it. Sebastian's first real laugh in Eleanor's presence. He was telling a story from his childhood about the time he'd tried to rescue a fox from hunters and ended up releasing it in his mother's parlor during a tea party. The chaos that ensued, ladies screaming, the fox knocking over priceless china, his father's horrified face, Sebastian described it all with unexpected humor and self-deprecation. Eleanor laughed, genuinely laughed, and the sound seemed to surprise both of them. But then Sebastian laughed too, a deep, unguarded sound that transformed his usually serious face into something lighter, younger, more alive. The servants passing by the dining room probably thought they'd stumbled into an alternate universe. The silent Duke and his ghost wife actually enjoying each other's company. That laugh changed the atmosphere of the entire castle. It was like someone had opened windows that had been shuttered for years, letting fresh air sweep through dusty corridors. The enigma of joy is that it's contagious. Once it enters a space, it starts spreading, touching everything, making even old sorrows feel less heavy. Physical touch came slowly, carefully, like two wild animals learning to trust. It started accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, when Sebastian poured Eleanor wine one evening and their hands brushed as he passed the glass. In any other context, it would have been nothing, a meaningless moment of contact. But for two people who'd maintained such careful distance, who'd built entire architectures around not touching, not getting close, it was electric. Neither Eleanor nor Sebastian pulled away immediately. Eleanor's fingers lingered on the cool glass where Sebastian's had been, and his hand remained suspended in the air for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The vestigio of warmth from that brief contact stayed with Eleanor long after dinner ended. A few days later, Eleanor touched Sebastian's shoulder while pointing out something in a book they were reading together. Sebastian didn't flinch or move away. Instead, he seemed to lean slightly into that contact, like a plant turning toward sunlight. These tiny moments of physical connection, so ordinary for most people, were revelations for Eleanor and Sebastian, proof that intimacy didn't have to be frightening, that being close to another person could feel safe instead of threatening. Here's where I need to get practical with you, because this applies to your own life, whether you realize it or not. Most people wait for the big romantic moment to start building a relationship. The perfect date, the ideal circumstances, the movie-worthy declaration. But that's backwards. The big moments are built on thousands of small ones. If you want deep connection with anyone, romantic partner, friend, family member, start with the tiny gestures. Ask them how their day really was and listen to the answer. Remember the small details they mention and bring them up later. Leave a note. Send a text that says, "Thinking of you." Share something that made you think of them. These aren't grand gestures, but they're the foundation everything else stands on. Eleanor and Sebastian didn't wake up one day, magically, in love. They built toward it, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, flower arrangement by flower arrangement. The conflito most people face is wanting instant results in a world that requires patient investment. But here's the segredo. Those small investments compound over time, creating something far stronger than any dramatic gesture could manufacture. The transformation in Eleanor and Sebastian's daily lives became noticeable to everyone in the household. The head housekeeper remarked to the butler that Eleanor seemed lighter somehow, less weighed down by invisible burdens. The butler noted that Sebastian had started whistling while working in his study, something he'd never done in all his years of service. Meals were no longer solitary affairs taken in separate wings, but shared experiences full of conversation and occasional laughter. Eleanor had started venturing into Sebastian's study to ask questions or share observations, and Sebastian had begun joining Eleanor in the library, reading in companionable silence or discussing whatever book had captured her attention. The castle itself seemed different, as if the stones recognized the shift in energy and responded in kind. Windows were opened more frequently, letting in light and air. Music could sometimes be heard drifting through hallways. Eleanor played piano, it turned out, and Sebastian had asked her to play one evening. These changes weren't revolutionary, they were evolutionary. The natural progression of two people deciding that maybe, just maybe, they could have more than the hollow existence they'd initially resigned themselves to. But the real power of those small gestures wasn't just in what they did. It was in what they represented. Every flower Eleanor left on Sebastian's desk said, "You deserve beauty in your life." Every genuine question Sebastian asked about Eleanor's day said, "Your thoughts and experiences matter to me." Every shared laugh said, "Joy is possible here, with you." They were rebuilding each other's sense of worth, not through grand pronouncements, but through consistent, gentle affirmations that contradicted the harsh verdicts they'd both internalized. The desaparecimiento of their old beliefs, that they were unlovable, inadequate, fundamentally flawed, happened gradually as new evidence accumulated. It's like how you might believe you're bad at something until someone patiently shows you otherwise through repeated demonstration and encouragement. Eleanor and Sebastian became each other's evidence that the cruel assessments of their past were wrong, that value isn't measured solely by meeting others' expectations, that being different doesn't mean being less than. And as they discovered this truth about each other, they began discovering it about themselves too. The silencio between them was no longer filled with awkwardness, but with comfort. The easy quiet of two people who didn't need to perform for each other anymore. Something was growing in that castle, in the space between the West Wing and the East Wing, in the gaps between their careful words and tentative touches. Neither Eleanor nor Sebastian would name it yet. Both were too cautious, too scarred by past rejections to risk labeling what was happening. But it was there, undeniable, and growing stronger with each passing day, fed by wildflowers and honest conversations and the revolutionary act of seeing each other as whole, worthy human beings. Just when you think you've escaped your past, just when you start believing that maybe, finally, you can build something new, that's when it comes knocking. For Eleanor and Sebastian, it arrived in the form of a letter bearing her family's seal, delivered on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Eleanor was having breakfast with Sebastian, discussing a book they'd both been reading, when the butler presented the correspondence on a silver tray. The moment Eleanor saw that seal, her face went pale. Sebastian noticed immediately. By now, he'd learned to read Eleanor's expressions, to sense when something was wrong. "What is it?" Sebastian asked, concern evident in his voice. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers and read words that reopened wounds she thought had finally started healing. Her family wanted more money. Not needed, wanted. They'd discovered through their network of aristocratic gossips that Sebastian was wealthier than they'd initially realized, and they wanted to renegotiate the terms of their arrangement. The segredo contempt in that phrase, the reduction of their daughter to a bargaining chip once again, was unmistakable. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulative language, the kind that families perfect over generations of practicing emotional extortion. It spoke of unfortunate financial circumstances and unforeseen difficulties that required immediate assistance. It reminded Eleanor of her duty to family and her obligation to those who raised her. But the real message, the one written between the lines in invisible ink, made of guilt and shame, was crystal clear. "We sold you once, and now we're back for a second payment. You're still just currency to us, still just a means to an end, still just useful instead of loved." Reading it felt like being dragged back into a dark room Eleanor had finally escaped, like having someone grab your ankle just as you're climbing out of a pit. The mystery wasn't why her family was doing this. Greed and entitlement explained that easily enough. The mystery was how they could be so blind to the damage they caused, so utterly disconnected from basic human decency, that they'd reopen their daughter's deepest wounds for money they didn't even need, just wanted. Here's what that kind of wound does, and I need you to understand this because maybe you've felt it too. Some injuries heal clean, the skin closes, new tissue forms, and eventually you can barely see where you were hurt. But other wounds leave scars, thick raised tissue that's more sensitive than the surrounding skin. When someone touches that scar, even accidentally, the pain comes rushing back as fresh as the day you were injured. That's what this letter did to Eleanor. All the progress she'd made, all the healing that had happened in her months at the castle with Sebastian, all the new beliefs she'd been building about her worth. The letter threatened to undo it all in one devastating stroke. Because here was proof, wasn't it? Proof that her family still saw Eleanor as merchandise, still valued her only for what she could provide them, still considered her existence worthwhile only in terms of utility. The occulto fear Eleanor had been fighting, that maybe her mother was right, maybe she really was only useful, came roaring back with a vengeance. Eleanor could feel herself shrinking back into that smaller, diminished version of herself she'd been trying so hard to outgrow. Sebastian watched Eleanor read the letter, saw the color drain from her face, saw her hands begin to shake. When Eleanor finally looked up at him, there were tears in her eyes. Not the kind that fall, but the kind you fight to hold back, because you've learned that crying is dangerous, that showing vulnerability gets weaponized against you. "They want more money," Eleanor said, her voice flat, emotionless. The tone people use when they're trying desperately not to feel anything. "They found out you're wealthier than they thought, and they want to renegotiate." The word tasted like poison in Eleanor's mouth. Sebastian took the letter from her unresisting fingers and read it himself, his expression growing darker with each line. Eleanor watched Sebastian, already knowing what he'd do. He'd pay, of course. That's what rich men did when faced with uncomfortable situations. They threw money at them until they disappeared. It was easier than confrontation, cleaner than conflict. Eleanor was already resigning herself to it, already accepting that this would be her life forever. Her family taking, Sebastian paying, and Eleanor caught in the middle as the object being purchased in installments. But then, Sebastian did something that changed everything. Something Eleanor never expected. He set the letter down carefully, looked directly into Eleanor's eyes, and said, "No." Just that one word, but it carried the weight of a revolution. "What?" Eleanor asked, not sure she'd heard correctly. "No," Sebastian repeated, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not giving them anything. And before you argue, before you tell me about duty or obligation or keeping peace, I need you to hear something." Sebastian moved his chair closer to Eleanor's, close enough that their knees almost touched, close enough that she could see the determination in his eyes. "You are not a transaction. You're not a business arrangement I need to maintain with quarterly payments. You're not obligated to carry guilt for having family members who see you as a resource to exploit. They failed you. They sold you to save themselves, and now they're back for more because that's what people who view others as objects do. They keep taking until someone finally says no." The revelation in Sebastian's words, the absolute clarity of his position, stunned Eleanor into silence. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why they should just pay and avoid the conflict. Because that's what you do when you've been conditioned to put everyone else's comfort above your own well-being. You become an expert at making excuses for the people who hurt you. "But they're my family," Eleanor started, and Sebastian gently interrupted. "Family doesn't do this. Family doesn't measure your worth by your bank account or your ability to produce heirs. Family doesn't sell you and then come back for more. What they are is toxic, and what they're doing is abuse dressed up in aristocratic language and delivered on expensive stationery." Sebastian paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, then continued with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You told me about what your mother said, about being useful somehow. I've watched you carry that wound around like it's the truth, instead of the cruelest lie someone who should have loved you decided to tell. I'm not going to fund their continued abuse of you. I'm not going to hand them money so they can keep treating you like property. And most importantly, you're not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep them warm." The códigos of family loyalty Eleanor had been raised with, the unspoken rules about duty and obligation, crumbled under the weight of Sebastian's words. The conflicto playing out on Eleanor's face was visible. Years of conditioning warring with this new perspective Sebastian was offering. "They'll be angry," Eleanor said weakly. "They'll say terrible things. They might even—" She trailed off, not wanting to voice the fear that they might publicly shame her, spread rumors, make her life difficult in the social circles she'd been raised in. Sebastian reached out slowly, giving Eleanor time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand. It was the most deliberate physical contact they'd shared, and the warmth of it anchored Eleanor to the moment. Let them be angry. Let them say whatever they want. Their opinion of you has been wrong from the start. Why give it power now? Sebastian's thumb traced small circles on the back of Eleanor's hand, a gesture of comfort that felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture could have been. You're not the person they described. You're not defective or inadequate or only valuable when you're useful to them. I've spent months getting to know you, the real you, and what I've found is someone intelligent, kind, thoughtful, and stronger than she realizes. Someone who survived being treated as less than human and still maintained her capacity for gentleness and hope. Here's what you need to understand about protection and choice, because this matters beyond just their story. There's something profoundly powerful about having someone in your corner, someone who sees your worth and refuses to let others diminish it. Not because you can't defend yourself, Eleanor absolutely could have, but because sometimes when you've been beaten down for so long, you start believing the lies. You need someone to hold up a mirror that shows the truth, instead of the distorted reflection your abusers have been showing you. That's what Sebastian was doing. He wasn't trying to rescue Eleanor like she was helpless. He was standing beside her and saying, "I see who you really are, and I won't participate in the fiction that you're anything less than valuable." The enigma of healing is that sometimes we need external validation to counteract internal doubt. We need someone else to believe in us before we can remember how to believe in ourselves. The desaparecimiento of her family's power over Eleanor began in that moment. Not because Sebastian was stronger or richer, but because he offered Eleanor something she'd never had. Unconditional support that didn't require her to be useful, perfect, or anything other than herself. Eleanor sat there processing everything Sebastian had said, feeling something shift deep inside her chest. The silencio between them wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy with meaning and the weight of decisions being made. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they're right about me? What if I am just less than?" Sebastian squeezed Eleanor's hand gently but firmly. "Then I'm less than too, by their logic. I don't fit their mold either, remember? I'm the strange duke who doesn't hunt or party or perform aristocracy the way they think I should. If we're both less than according to their standards, maybe the problem isn't us. Maybe it's their standards." The simple logic of that statement, the way it reframed everything, hit Eleanor like a revelation. They were both refugees from a world that measured worth by impossible standards. Both survivors of families and societies that couldn't accept deviation from narrow definitions of acceptable. And in finding each other, in building this unexpected connection, Eleanor and Sebastian had created something those rigid systems never could. Authentic companionship based on seeing and accepting each other as they actually were. The vestigio of Eleanor's old beliefs, the ones that said she was only valuable when useful, began to crack under the pressure of this new truth. Eleanor wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally. And together, Eleanor and Sebastian were going to face her family's demands with something she'd never had before. The strength that comes from knowing someone believes in you, not despite your perceived flaws, but including them, seeing you as whole and worthy exactly as you are. So here we are, at the end of part 1, and Eleanor and Sebastian have just crossed a threshold that changes everything. They've moved from strangers bound by contract to allies bound by choice. But here's the question that matters most. What are you going to do with what you've just learned? Because this isn't just Eleanor's story. It's a mirror being held up to your own life, your own wounds, your own beliefs about what makes you worthy of love and connection. And mirrors are only useful if you actually look at them and then take action based on what you see. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this. Who are the people in your life that make you feel like you need to earn your place at the table? Who are the voices, external or internal, telling you that you're only valuable when you're useful, productive, perfect, or meeting someone else's impossible standards? Eleanor spent years carrying her mother's cruel assessment like it was truth instead of abuse. Sebastian spent years isolating himself because the world couldn't accept his sensitivity. How much of your life are you spending trying to fix things about yourself that were never broken in the first place? What would happen if you stopped performing for people who can't see your value anyway, and started investing in connections with people who see you clearly and choose you regardless? Here's what I want you to understand. The transformation Eleanor and Sebastian are experiencing didn't happen because they became different people. It happened because they found someone who saw their authentic selves and didn't run away. But that kind of connection requires courage. The courage to stop hiding, to risk being seen, to show up as you actually are instead of as you think you should be. So let me challenge you. Where in your life are you still wearing masks? Where are you still pretending to be fine when you're falling apart? Where are you still accepting conditional approval instead of demanding unconditional acceptance? And most importantly, what small gesture, like Eleanor's wildflowers or Sebastian's genuine questions, could you offer to someone today that says, "I see you, and you matter"? Think about the segredo we've uncovered in this story. Small, consistent actions build something far stronger than grand gestures ever could. You don't need to make dramatic changes to transform your relationships or your sense of self-worth. You need to plant seeds, water them. Be patient with the growth that happens invisibly beneath the surface. So here's your assignment. And yes, I'm serious about this. Identify one relationship in your life. Romantic, friendship, family, doesn't matter. Where you want deeper connection. This week, do 3 small things that communicate, "You matter to me." Ask a question and actually listen to the answer. Share something vulnerable. Notice something about them that others overlook and acknowledge it. Watch what happens when you consistently show up with genuine interest and care. That's how you build what Eleanor and Sebastian are building. But let's talk about the harder part, because growth isn't just about building new connections. It's about setting boundaries with toxic ones. Eleanor's family came back demanding more, and Sebastian said no. When was the last time you said no to someone who treats you like a resource instead of a person? When was the last time you refused to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm? I'm not saying cut everyone off or burn bridges unnecessarily. I'm saying stop funding your own mistreatment. Stop making excuses for people who consistently show you they don't value you. Stop carrying guilt for having boundaries. The people who truly care about you will respect your limits. The people who don't respect your limits don't truly care about you, no matter what they claim. Here's the revelation that changed everything for Eleanor and Sebastian, and it can change everything for you too. You don't need to be fixed to be worthy. You don't need to meet someone else's standards to deserve love, respect, and genuine connection. The things about you that don't fit the mold, your sensitivity, your struggles, your unconventional path, whatever makes you feel different, those aren't bugs in your programming. They're features. They're what make you uniquely you. And the right people will see those features and be drawn to them, not repelled by them. But you have to stop apologizing for them first. You have to stop trying to sand down your edges to fit into spaces that were never designed for you anyway. So let me get real with you for a second. Are you living like Eleanor at the beginning of this story, accepting whatever scraps of approval come your way because you've been convinced you don't deserve the full meal? Or are you ready to start living like Eleanor at the end of part 1, standing beside someone who sees your worth and refusing to let your past dictate your future? The choice is yours, but I'm telling you right now, one path leads to slow death of the spirit, and the other leads to the kind of authentic connection that makes life actually worth living. Which path are you choosing today? And here's the uncomfortable truth we need to address. Transformation is possible, but it's not comfortable. Eleanor had to confront the wound her mother gave her. Sebastian had to admit his fears out loud. They both had to risk vulnerability with someone who could hurt them. Growth requires you to walk through the discomfort instead of around it. So whatever wound you're carrying, whatever lie you've believed about yourself, whatever fear is keeping you isolated, it's time to name it, out loud, to someone you trust. Because the mysterio you're protecting by keeping it hidden isn't protecting you at all. It's imprisoning you. And the key to your cell is honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to let someone see the parts of you that you've been taught to hide. I want you to do something right now. before you move on to whatever's next in your day. Close your eyes for a moment and think about the last time someone really saw you. Not the performance, not the mask, not the version of you that meets expectations, but the real, messy, complicated, beautiful you. How did that feel? Now ask yourself, when was the last time you let someone that close? If it's been a while, that's your answer. That's where the work needs to happen. Because Eleanor and Sebastian's story shows us that connection isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone brave enough to be real with you, and being brave enough to be real with them. That's where the magic happens. That's where transformation becomes possible. Here's my final challenge to you, and this is where the rubber meets the road. What's one belief about yourself that you inherited from someone else? One story about your inadequacy that you've been carrying around like truth? I want you to write it down. Then I want you to ask yourself, is this actually true? Or is this just what someone who couldn't see my value decided about me? Because chances are, it's the latter. And once you see that, once you really understand that most of your self-doubt comes from other people's limitations, not your own, everything changes. You stop trying to prove yourself to people who were never going to see you anyway. You stop accepting less than you deserve. You start building the kind of life Eleanor and Sebastian are building. One based on authenticity, mutual respect, and the revolutionary idea that you're worthy exactly as you are. But this is only part one of their story. And honestly, it's only part one of yours too. Eleanor and Sebastian have made incredible progress, but they've got challenges ahead. They're going to have to defend their connection against people who don't understand it. They're going to have to keep choosing vulnerability even when it's scary. They're going to have to build something entirely new because the old models don't work for people like them, people like us, who refuse to fit into boxes we were never meant to occupy. And you've got the same journey ahead. The question is, are you ready for it? So here's what I need you to do. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell because part 2 of Eleanor and Sebastian's story is coming, and you're not going to want to miss what happens next. But more importantly, subscribe because you're committing to your own transformation. You're saying, yes, I'm ready to challenge the beliefs that have been holding me back. Yes, I'm ready to build authentic connections instead of performing for approval. Yes, I'm ready to see myself as worthy, even if the people who raised me couldn't see it. That's what this channel is about. Not just telling stories, but using those stories to help you rewrite your own narrative from victim to victor, from broken to whole, from performing to being real. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's one small gesture you're going to make this week to build deeper connection with someone who matters to you? Or what's one boundary you need to set with someone who's been treating you like Eleanor's family treated her? Let's build a community of people who are done accepting crumbs and ready to demand the full meal. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not broken, they're not too much or not enough. They're exactly right for the people who can actually see them. And remember, your worth isn't determined by the people who rejected you. It's revealed by the people who choose you, again and again, exactly as you are. Now go plant some seeds, water them with consistency and courage, and watch what grows. I'll see you in part 2, where Eleanor and Sebastian's connection deepens, their past comes back to haunt them, and they discover that building something real requires even more bravery than they thought. Until then, keep showing up as your authentic self. The right people are looking for exactly what you have to offer.